Hey, mic should be rolling, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
There you go.
Awesome.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thanks for having me. So this is exciting to talk about. I was a coordinator for WildEcol when I was doing my master's here, so it's kind of like a fun full circle moment. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about how we manage our piping plovers around Diefenbaker. Um, So I've given this presentation in parts, kind of in different areas before, so I'm sort of pulling it all together into a longer format one. But yeah, so for general content today, we'll talk about piping plovers, talk about Diefenbaker, we'll talk about why we're managing piping plovers at Diefenbaker, how we utilize our risk framework, general results for the project, since it's been running for quite some time now, and a summary. So to get into it, who is familiar with piping plovers? Right hand. Okay, yeah. Someone else I've worked with described them as charismatic microfauna, and I really like that term. They have a lot of character. So they are these small, stocky shorebirds that are in the plover family. So killdeer are kind of the most common one that I think a lot of people see. I'm a little bit biased, but I think piping plovers are quite a bit cuter, but they are also smaller. That's objective, and they nest in these very specific habitats. So on these flat, sandy, and gravelly beaches without vegetation. They are across North America where they're endemic, and there are two subspecies that are managed in Canada. So there's the Atlantic subspecies along the Atlantic coast, and then we have the Great Plains subspecies, which is divided into two populations, which is the Great Plains of the Prairie provinces, the Midwest of the US, and then smaller population around the Great Lakes. Both parents incubate, and the young are precocial. So as soon as they hatch, they are downy, their eyes are open, and they are running around. So very similar to chicks and ducklings, things like that, as opposed to sort of naked, blind little babies and the passerine birds and stuff like that. In terms of conservation, so piping plovers have been listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act, and they've been listed there for quite a while. Um, they're also listed under the Migratory Bird Convention Act and the Saskatchewan Wildlife Act as a species at risk. Their population is pretty small, so only about 8,000 adults at the last estimate, which happened in 2020. And Diefenbaker is a very significant location for these birds. We have about 30% of the Prairie Canada piping plover population. Say that three times fast. As of the last regional census, which occurred in 2024. So this is a map from the regional census with the Saskatchewan results. And that big blob of yellow is high density, blue is lower density, and that's really centered over Diefenbaker. And then there is another pretty high density area around Chaplin and Reed Lakes, Old Wives, and then into the Willow Bunch area. Because they are endangered, they have threats identified. So these include predators, human disturbance, habitat loss, and water management, which is how WSA is involved in this whole situation. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of piping plovers, we really have to focus on Lake Diefenbaker for a minute, because this is really puts into focus why WSA is involved with this as like a water management organization. And it's because of Lake Diefenbaker. So it was created in 1967 through the damming of the South Saskatchewan River. The figure that I have up here is the entire drainage basin for the lake. So just as a point of reference, if you can see, it's circled, but Diefenbaker is here. And there are actually four drainage basins that go into the lake. So the South Saskatchewan River, we also have the Red Deer River, Bow River, and Old Man River systems that extend all the way to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And that's important because that's obviously a lot of water that's being collected over the system in the prairies, but there is also the added complicating factor of the snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains, which is pretty significant and happens in the spring. And why that's important is because we essentially have this ecological trap happening, which is where an organism, in this case plovers, makes a choice based on outdated information on the landscape, and it's usually a negative choice. So this is a diagram of the hydrograph for Diefenbaker, and this is the yearly cycle of the water level. So we have months along the x-axis, and then lake level in meters above sea level on the y. And that teal line in the center is kind of the average lake level that we're seeing throughout the year, with the dotted lines as minimum and maximum levels. So it's obviously very dynamic. We draw down the water over the winter. So we reach the lowest point in the reservoir in late winter, early spring. So that's kind of March-ish, depending on the year. And then we have this initial little influx of water where it bumps back up. And this is the local runoff in the system. This happens around April, and then it usually stabilizes around May. And this is important because this is when the piping plovers come back. So they show up to the lake and they see these big, wide, flat, gravelly beaches that they really like. And they set up shop. They set up nesting territories and pick nest locations and lay eggs. But obviously we're not done with this graph. So there is a secondary influx of water from the mountain snowmelt that happens usually in early June. It can sometimes happen in late May. And we have this really big influx of water coming into the system. And that looks like this. And that's a problem because this is when birds are incubating their nests. Obviously, nests are stationary on the landscape. This can be a really big problem if the water is coming up very high. And to give kind of more of a visual on that, I've got this, I hope works. So this is a satellite image of one of the beaches that we manage. And it is kind of a knit together of the different imagery for a time lapse between April and July. So this is in early May. We have a lot of beach available, but then we have the water coming up. This is the end of June where the beach really recedes. And by the end of July, it is quite high and there's not a whole lot of habitat left. So this is what we're seeing on the ground as managers for this. And it becomes a balancing act, obviously, because a lot of people know what Diefenbaker is. Very large reservoir in Saskatchewan and the largest in southern Saskatchewan. So it's a very critical resource for a lot of people. It's used in agriculture industry, irrigation, there's power generation and recreation, stuff like that. It supplies water to 60% of the provincial population. So the water you're drinking now is coming through Diefenbaker, as well as the water that's coming through Regina and Moose Jaw. A lot of people rely on that, and it creates quite a bit of electricity too. But we obviously can't forget about these birds. It's the single largest single site breeding population of piping plovers in North America. And then we have a third of the Canadian population of birds around the lake as well. They're endangered. There's a lot of people very highly focused on these. And without management, we have very low productivity. So there's been estimates and models run with in cases where there's no management done, in about 44% of years, we're seeing complete reproductive failure for these birds, which is unacceptable. So because of this, WSA manages for the birds as well as the water, and that allows for additional flexibility in the system. And what that looks like is through this management approach. So this is just a screen grab from the recovery strategy and action plan. Basically, I'm highlighting that Diefenbaker is a very important location for these birds. So it's mentioned by name 4 times in the species stewardship section for Saskatchewan. And what that means is we have these kind of 3 broad goals that we're tackling. So we're looking to maximize years where water levels increase less than 3 meters between May and July. So when the plovers are breeding, we're looking to deploy as many predator exclosures as possible. And then we are looking to relocate nests threatened by rising water and monitoring the success of those nests. So we utilize this risk framework, and there's a lot going on here. So I'm not going to get too in the weeds with this slide. It's just sort of as a reference point to come back to because there's a lot of different pieces at play here. So I just want to give kind of a base for this, but we have it organized in 3 sections, and we start managing this risk well before the plovers show up with our pre-season risk assessment. So with this, we're looking at our long-term biological data. This is basically all previous years where we've monitored the plovers. And we have these general trends that we're looking at from the last year where we kind of factor this into the coming year. So very generally, if we have lower water levels, we have more breeding birds. Makes sense. A lot more habitat, a lot more birds on the landscape. If we have higher water, we have fewer birds and then also fewer chicks. Again, makes a lot of sense since the habitat is the limiting factor here. So in this diagram, we have the predicted May 1st water level along the x-axis and the overall number of individuals on the y. So we have really low water, we have really high birds, but we're trying to look for a sort of happy medium, which I will talk about in a minute. And 2025 is highlighted on there since this is from our last risk assessment. And then again, looking at water level rise over the period of the breeding season. If we have more of that, we have usually fewer chicks since the flood risk is higher. So in this diagram, we have change in water levels and then productivity of fledged chicks per pair along the x-axis. So again, looking for a happy medium. Obviously, we want to maximize that as much as possible, but there is a little bit of room for that. And then we're looking at water level prediction. So this happens in usually May to April, kind of when we're having the spring melt happening. And I talk with hydrology for this. So they pull together all of their metrics that they utilize and kind of put it into a model, and it gives us an output. So some of those metrics include conditions that freeze up. So we're looking at precipitation in the fall, soil moisture in the fall, what the type of precipitation that we got was, overall drought index, and then kind of stream and river flows. All of those factor in to kind of give an idea of like what the moisture is on the local landscape. And then we look at snow conditions across Saskatchewan. So this happens over the winter, usually in February-ish, towards the end of February when we kind of have that maximum amount of snow on the landscape. And there's a few different things that get factored in. And this is all across the province. So we're looking at snow depth, but then also snow water equivalent. So fluffy snow has a lot less water in it than icy, heavy snow. That can make quite a difference depending on the area. That'll factor into how much runoff is happening locally and what we can expect early in the spring for the reservoir. And then finally, we're looking at snow conditions in the Rockies. So what the snowpack is doing and what we can expect kind of as that melts in later spring and early summer. In the last few years, snowpack has been quite low, but this year is a record snowpack. So this is already in my mind. And we're not even in February yet, that we have a lot of snow to melt over there. So all of these things get sent to hydrology. They put it in their model, and they give this output that comes to me, which is kind of the guidelines for Diefenbaker regarding piping plovers. And what it looks like is something like this. So this is a complicated looking diagram, but we'll walk through it. It's not that scary. So with that output from hydrology, they give us they have these guidelines that they're trying to work within. And basically, I'm focusing on this orange rectangle. So we want to have a May 12th water level at a minimum of 551 meters above sea level, maximum 554. So we want to stay in that sweet spot. And then we also want to minimize the change in water level so it doesn't go above 3 meters. So that's kind of on the left and right side. And we want to avoid water levels below 551 completely. And that's because it is a low risk if we don't have a lot of water level change, but it gets very, very high risk very fast if we have a lot more water coming into the system. So if the water is low in the lake, it exposes a lot of habitat that the plovers love, but it floods very quickly. So if we have like a rain event, which are very hard to sort of predict well, we can have a lot of water coming into the system very fast, and it makes it hard to move them. So we avoid that low section entirely, and we accept that we're going to take on some risk, but we can manage accordingly if we live within this orange rectangle zone. I will note that there is the gray section right at the top, and that is when there is no habitat available. So the filling of the reservoir is about it's 555 meters above sea level and a bit. So once we get above that, there's no habitat available to the birds. So if there's no habitat available, they are not nesting in the reservoir. I do have different years kind of plotted on that graph. I will note that 2011 is the only year in that gray zone, and it's a bit of the problem child. So it shows up again in some of the other data. But yeah, so we try and exist in this manageable to moderate manageable risk scenario, and we do that through our active risk assessment. So this is happening within season, and just to kind of bring back to this graph or this figure and where we are. So this is now happening during our field season. And the within season assessment and risk reduction activities happen kind of at the same time. There's like this cycle situation that's happening. That's the breadth of our field work. So I will talk about that a little bit because we are collecting the bulk of our biological data for this. So this is a close-up of Diefenbaker. And we survey from the Garner Dam, which is up here at the north end of the lake, all the way south to the Capel Dam, if my pointer wants to work, which is down here. And then we survey all the way west to Saskatchewan Landing. So all in, it's about 175 kilometers of lake. A lot of work. We have 38 beaches that we survey around the lake through a combination of walking and boating, and we resurvey those weekly. So it's myself and 6 technicians who do this. And what we're looking for is basically birds acting nesty, which sounds extremely vague, but they are very suspicious when they have a nest around. I find shorebirds are just kind of nonchalant if you're just walking by them on land, and they're just kind of foraging on the shoreline. But if they have a nest or something around, they are watching you, following you, and a lot of the time peeping at you and occasionally broken winging if you're really close to the nest. So those are all these behavioral cues that we're tying into to get a feel for if these birds are nesting in the area. It can be very slow going because these birds are really cryptic. So there's actually a nest in this bottom photo. They are hard to find. So if there's a lot of bird activity, we can go like a kilometer or two in like several hours. Like it's very slow. So anybody have guesses on where this nest would be? It is small in the photo, but right there. So those eggs blend in very well. And even when you know where the nest is, you're walking up to it, you often need a second spotter to be like, this is where the nest is, because you can lose track of it very easily. So it is quite the endeavor, even just finding these. Once we find the nest, we collect all of our data. So we get the nest location. Oftentimes we're exclosing the nest as soon as we find it, which is part of our risk reduction activities. So the cycling thing happening, which I will discuss more in a bit. And then we are aging the nest. So we do that through egg flotation. So if anyone's ever checked to see if your chicken eggs are still good, it's kind of the same principle. So fresher eggs sink, older eggs float because they have a larger air cell in the egg. And with shorebirds, that's a very consistent way of aging them. So depending on how high or low they float, you can get an idea of overall age of the egg. And from that, we can determine clutch initiation date and estimated hatch date, so when those chicks are going to show up. All of this is collected on Survey 123, which is a really, really handy field program where we can collect geospatial data on our phones. And it's made things really, really streamlined. So once we have these nest locations, we plot them on our digital elevation model for Diefenbaker. So this is a figure of the DEM. It was created through the collection of LiDAR, which happened in 2022. So LiDAR is flown over the entire reservoir. And this was originally done with the hydrology group at WSA to get a better estimate of how much water is actually in the system. But we were able to co-op this for piping plovers. So this has been really handy and really high tech. So from this, we have the general frame of the reservoir. And then we can plot the individual elevations of every plover nest through Survey 123. And that data is available almost immediately because it's collected via phone and then sent to the ArcGIS online platform. I say almost because we do need connectivity, and there are a few dead zones around the lake. So it's not completely immediate, but it's a lot better than what it was. Previously, all of this was done manually. So we go out doing surveys all day, we come back with the GPS locations we have of each nest, we would plug it in on a topographical map and try and estimate elevation that way. So it was a very labor-intensive process that way. Slow and less accurate just because the GPSs are less accurate and you do have kind of this human error thing and topo maps. So this is much, much better. And then finally, we factor in the lake level predictions. So this is something that comes out weekly. It's publicly available through WSA. They have this kind of forecast for the Diefenbaker system throughout like the open water season. And we're looking at the daily mean elevation for Diefenbaker. So this is like the third column here and how it's changing. So this is actually a screenshot from last year, so 2025, which you will notice is actually going down a little bit, which is not the usual. Oh no, it's not going down. Sorry, I was looking at it wrong. Whoops. Yeah, so it is going up. We did have a low water level year last year though, and it was not as critical for this, which was kind of a nice respite. Some years are quite busy. Yeah, so we're looking at the elevation and how that changes over the span of 10 days. So once we have the peak forecast for that, we run our risk assessment with everything that we know. And kind of broken into 3 different sections. So we have imminent risk. This is when we have to move our nests. These are all pretty self-explanatory, but imminent risk, it's either at the predicted elevation or below it. So these nests are going to flood. We have kind of a moderate risk section, which is sort of gives us a bit more of a buffer. So we know that these nests are low, but maybe not necessarily the highest priority for triaging. But we want to keep an eye on them. And then low risk, they're high and dry. We'll check back on them kind of throughout the season, but they are a non-issue at the moment. And we run these risk assessments multiple times through the season, at least every week when these forecasts come out, but I will often do it if there's anything that happens. So if we have significant rainfall or something like that, we're redoing this and reassessing what might be happening in the system. This happens through desktop assessment. So with the DMs and the GPS locations and all that, we also do ground truthing. So when the technicians are out doing nest checks, doing nest surveys, we're also checking these nests on the landscape to make sure that there's nothing that's surprising. We obviously have less error with how this system has been improved, but there's always a little bit of error with GPS, just how things roll. So we want to double check that because that can make quite a difference actually on the landscape. And then there is some shifting of like sand and sediment from year to year too. So we want to make sure that everything is all good on the ground before we look elsewhere. And this is kind of a picture zoomed in of what I'm looking at when I'm doing these risk assessments. So this is the Summit Creek Beach. It is the same location that I showed in that time lapse a little bit before. And this is the DEM model. So red is highest elevation and then blue is lowest. And we actually have the creek down here where you can see is the lowest elevation. All those plot points are locations of piping plover nests. This was in 2023, which I will note is we didn't have any significant water rise that year. Because I will show a satellite photo, which is from a different year, and it looks pretty dramatic, but that's not actually what happened with these nests. So I just want to make that clear to everybody going forward before it looks more dramatic than it is. But it is something to keep in mind. So this is what full capacity the lake looks like. Obviously, there are quite a few nests there alone that are not on land anymore. So what we have to do is plan how we're going to move those. And some of them are straightforward. Move them as close as possible to the high shoreline as you can, as quickly as possible. But there are situations where it's a little bit more complex. So I'm focusing specifically on this sort of S-shape move here. And I'll go back to the DEM because you can see it better. So these nests in this corner here, this was actually a re-nest bird, so there's only one nest active there at a time. But if we had to move it, we'd actually have to move up and over since there's this low area of just kind of a depression that's usually actually filled with water when we're on the landscape. So it's not exactly a straight shot, and we have to keep that in mind when we're actually moving them. So birds like that, we would have to move earlier because there's a little bit more stuff we have to factor in. That low area could fill with water much more quickly than the actual elevation of the nest. So we need to factor that in. And if we miss that boat, it is a potentially a very long move because we'd have to reassess and go somewhere else. So it would have to even, where's my pointer? Instead of just kind of going here, it would like maybe have to go all the way around or something like that. It gets very much more complicated with time not on our side. So we have to think a few moves ahead in some of these scenarios. All right, so that leads into our risk reduction activities. So again, some of these are happening as we're monitoring the nests. Some of them only happen if we need to, and some of them are emergency procedures. So preventative, this includes the nest exclosures. So that's the most significant one that we utilize the most. In some cases, we don't do it so much now, But if the reservoir was very low and we had no way of raising that water level, and there was habitat which we don't want the birds nesting on, we actually do directed nest selection, which is basically putting up mylar deterrents so they don't nest in areas we don't want them. Active risk reduction is our nest translocations. Those happen to a certain extent, usually every year. And then egg salvage I include there, but that has only ever happened once, and it's an emergency procedure. So that happened in 2005 when there was a lot of flooding in the reservoir, and they were actually raised, captively raised chicks from eggs and then released later on in the season just because of the flooding. We keep that in our back pocket as a just in case, but we don't try and avoid that as much as possible. It is hugely labor intensive. And then no action is sometimes, it's very situation dependent. So there's the odd time where the birds are not receptive to exclosures. So if they don't like that, then we won't put an exclosure out because we don't want to have them abandoned potentially. So it's very dependent on small details like that. This is just that same screenshot because these risk reduction activities factor into the recovery strategy with the species stewardship. So what these look like. So this is an exclosure. Again, preventative. So we're trying to do this to as many nests as possible. And this is like 2-inch by 2-inch stucco wire, I think is what it's called. In a cylinder and then with mesh over top. And these are really portable. They're really lightweight and they're easy to make and cost effective. And we try to deploy these on as many nests as we can because depredation is the leading cause of nest failure for piping plovers just across the board, like all of North America. And we try to reduce that as much as possible. So if we can reduce depredation, we also reduce the prevalence of re-nests that happen later in the season. Time, obviously, in this situation is against us when it comes to the water level coming into the system. So we want to avoid those later nesting birds as much as possible. So for example, if a bird nested early in the season and it hatches its chicks, that potentially can happen in early June before the water level really comes up. Bird B nests in the exact same location, but is a later re-nest because a coyote or something ate its first clutch. That nest is potentially delayed by a week or two. And even if it's in the same location, because it's later in June, we have this potential for flooding since the water is coming in. So this reduces our need to translocate to some extent. Our WSA goal is about 80% of nests exposed per year. And that works out pretty well. The design allows adults and chicks to move in and out. So these, the grid on the wire frame is actually big enough that adults can go back and forth, no problem. And then the chicks are even smaller, so they can move very freely. We have an animal care protocol for this, so we can only deploy it once there's 3 or more eggs in the nest bowl, since the parents are more invested then. And once we put it on the nest, we watch to make sure that the parents come back. So if there's any issues and the parents don't like it or a little fearful of it or something like that, we remove it and let them do their thing, which does happen occasionally, but the vast majority of birds are pretty receptive to this. So this is what it actually looks like from year to year. We've exceeded that goal in 75% of years. There are a couple low ones, which I'll talk about. 70% of nests are exposed on the day that they're found. So this is when we're doing nest surveys, and they're found either late in the lay period or during incubation. We're carrying those exposures on us and we can deploy them immediately. So this is really fast and works really well. Usually if they can't be deployed day of, it's because they're still in lay and there's not enough eggs present. So we have to come back at a later time, which gives us a little bit of delay on the exposure period. Obviously, that does give a little bit more opportunity where they're exposed, but overall, pretty good. Limitations range from ecological to logistical factors. So in 2014 and 2021, these are very low exclosure rate years. And this is because while it doesn't happen often, there are sometimes predators that learn. Exclosures mean there's a snack inside. So in those years, there were specific beaches where it was like a fox or a coyote or something that learned that if you dug under the exclosure or knocked it over, you got a reward. So to nip that in the bud, we actually stopped exposing nests on those beaches, which reduced our exclosure rates, but it didn't create any lasting issues. It was a very transient, year-specific problem. In terms of logistical factors, so 2020, challenging year, as I'm sure everyone remembers. We had some pretty big limitations with the COVID-19 pandemic, so that was obviously impacting how flexible we were to get out there and expose nests. In 2022, we were a bit low because the water levels were low and there were actually some more remote boat launches that were not accessible because they were actually sanded in and up too high. And then we had some boat issues that we are trying to rectify in 2025, which got us out late in the season for monitoring those river birds. So there are a few things that come up and we assess as needed. But overall, last year, even though it was kind of low, we had really good recruitment, which was nice. Okay, so for nest translocation, this is our active risk reduction. This only happens if it's absolutely necessary. So we're relocating nests that are low and at risk of flooding. These obviously reduce flood risk. It doesn't completely eliminate it. There are some situations where water rises too fast or other things like that, but this can help to mitigate it quite a lot. This is where we physically move the nests to higher elevation. So we'll actually make a temporary nest bowl in this little, it's like a plant pot, and you move that incrementally up the beach. So often it's about a half meter to a meter, maybe a couple meters at a time, depending on how the layout of the beach is, how receptive the parents are. Until it is out of the danger zone in terms of water level rise. So this happens over an extended period of time. It is very labor intensive. So we're not doing this just for fun. This is a last resort situation where they are going to flood if we don't utilize this method. So what that looks like, we've been doing this since 2006, and about a quarter of the all nests monitored since 2006 have been translocated. On average, about 37% of nests are at risk any given year, but there is a lot of variation with that. So it can range from 0%, which like last year in 2023 were very low. We had very limited water level rise, or it can range to upwards of 100%. So these are these really wet years where we have a lot of water coming into the system. We had, I think, our highest moves ever in 2024, and that was still only 25% of the nests move, and we moved like 42 nests, if I'm remembering correctly. So it is very labor intensive. I will note that at risk doesn't necessarily equate to translocated nests, just because we sometimes assess as at risk, but timing works in our favor. So there might be a nest that's fairly low once the water comes up in about 10 days, But if it's scheduled to hatch tomorrow and it's in hatch, we generally leave it depending on, I mean, there's more to that, but there are situations where we're like, okay, they're good, ready to roll. We don't need to move them. Overall, with nest translocation, we have 53% success. That is a little bit lower than non-translocated nests. But the daily survival rate doesn't differ between translocated and non-translocated nests. So there are a lot of different factors that come into play when we're talking about nest fate. It's not necessarily the translocation aspect of it. Although I will recognize that it is a very disturbance heavy method, which is why we only do that as a last resort. And I will say that the 50% or the 53% success is significant because all those nests would have flooded otherwise. So we're adding quite a lot more birds into the system that way through the translocation. Just generally to give kind of a handle for everyone in the general nesting for the reservoir. So we've been doing this project since 2005 with WSA. Since that time, we've monitored 2,168 nests in that period of time, which averages out to about 103 nests per year, although there's a lot of variation with that. The range being between 9 nests. So this was in 2011, again, the problem child, which I was talking about, showing up again. We had a very high water year that year with very limited habitat. So there was really not a lot of birds in that system that year. And then our current high was in 2024 with 177 nests. And we've really been on this kind of high influx for the last few years with upwards of, I think, 140 in 2022 and then rising up to 170 and then 164 this past year. So really high numbers around the lake right now. And then we do an annual census just to get a better feel for how the population is doing. So this is an annual count we do in early June. The timing of this is when most birds are nesting. So there's not a lot of adults wandering around. Usually they're tied up with either being on a territory or tending to nests. Occasionally we do have chicks at that point in time too, but they are very small, so they're not complicating the numbers because we're not counting fledged chicks at this point. Accidentally. So we're counting all adult plovers. This is the same protocol as the International Piping Plover Census, which had been going for every 5 years since the early 90s, which has shifted into the Prairie Canada Piping Plover Census. So now it's a regional one with different partners, but we can compare how our numbers are doing to the broader population in the prairies. Obviously, there's a lot of variability. This is pretty common with plovers. They live in a very dynamic landscape. Water levels can have quite an impact on where birds go in a given year. We moderate those levels a little bit, but there is still this fluctuation. As you can see by 2011, again, showing up here. We also have a pretty big dip in 2020 because of the pandemic. We weren't able to have census volunteers, which hugely help us to cover the ground we need to get the numbers. But we have a pretty modest population growth of about 4% over that period of time. So that's nice to see. And then finally, we have our success and productivity. So a lot of our work is flood management, but like to get an actual handle on like how that works. And if it's doing what it needs to, we also need to look at the overall success in the system. And then the productivity of the chicks produced. And this is really just a slide to show cute plover babies. So they're precocial, they hatch. Ideally, we can assess nest fate and very easily if we find chicks in the bowl. But we have a few other methods to utilize evidence if we don't time up the estimated hatch date quite perfectly. They are these little cotton balls on toothpicks from days 1 to 5. They kind of hit their awkward teenage phase around like 12 to 14 days. And then they fledge at 25 days. We utilize a benchmark of 18 days to get a fledgling rate, just because waiting until you're at 2020 or at 25 days, it can be kind of difficult to refine them since they can fly around and don't stay in one place. So we utilize that 18-day benchmark instead. And success is the first metric that we utilize. So this is any nest that hatches at least one chick. It's a binary approach to things. Usually if nests fail, they fail spectacularly. So you'll have a whole clutch loss. But there are some instances where there are some eggs that are just infertile or other things. So if any of the chicks come out of the nest, they are treated as successful. We utilize Mayfield success, which is about 57%. That's over all years. So we do have a lot of variability again. Again, 2011 with no success at all, just because of how high the water level was. And there was no habitat available for them, even with moves. So a poor year overall for that, but we do have a lot of high years as well. And in the last 4 years, we've been up above 70%, which is really, really good for shorebirds as a whole. Shorebirds can have quite low success in general. And then looking at productivity, so this is our fledgling rate. So this is how many chicks are produced per pair per year. And average across all of it is about 0.89 chicks per pair. With about 100 nests per year, that's about 89 chicks total produced at any given time, although there is a lot of fluctuation again with this. So the goal fledgling rate is between 0.86 and 1.16 chicks per pair to maintain the population. So when we're looking at this diagram, it's this little gray band kind of in the middle. And generally, especially in the last few years, we've been in that zone. We've had one dip kind of in 2021, again with the pandemic and a few lower years. And I will note that in this graph, we've got annual fledgling rate, so lots of variability with the dotted line. Again, this happens in plovers quite a bit. So we also look at the 5-year rolling average because that gets rid of some of the noise. And that rolling average puts us into this really nice zone for the most part. I will note too that we've had really good fledging kind of since 2016. And with the working backwards, if we go back to 2011, obviously that was a very challenging year for a lot of reasons. But we also had our draft Diefenbaker management plan unveiled that year. So that incorporated the Piping Plover guidelines that I talked about in our risk management framework, where we want to kind of limit the water level rise and minimum and maximum levels in the spring. And with that, since that time, we've really had this uptick in good plover fledgling numbers. So to me, that shows up that kind of operating plan works well for what we're looking at. Obviously, there's some variation there still, but much better than what they were doing when they were still trying to figure out this management process. So we've got to that point, which is good to see. So I'm getting to the end of this, but I did want to talk about 2025 as a glance, since this is our most recent year, and I think everyone always likes to see kind of those kind of numbers. So we had 164 nests monitored in 2025. This is our third highest total nesting number since WSA took over the program. Our parent nest success was 80.5%, which is very high. And we had 144 chicks fledged. So that was really good, which puts us at 0.95 chicks fledged prepare for 2025. And then on census, we counted 278 adults, which is a third of the Saskatchewan population based on the census from last year, or the broader census from last year. So they're doing really good, which is great to see. In summary, Lake Diefenbaker has the largest population of piping plovers in Western Canada, with a third of it. I've said that a few times, but I'll say it again. Our exclosure goals have been met in 3 and every 4 years. The translocations that we utilize have reduced flood risk by 88% since 2005, or 2005. And on average, the lake produces about 89 chicks per year, but that's obviously averaged across all those years, with last year being extremely good. The blended management techniques that we have used have been effective at maintaining the population at this site, and cumulatively, we've monitored more than 2,000 nests since 2005. So I want to say thank you to a lot of people. This is obviously a very big, intensive project that can't be done by one person. So specifically the 2025 Piping Plover team, Anna, Fisher, Loren, Luke, Nick, and Serena. They were awesome. And then I feel like whenever I talk about this project, I need people who have like worked on this as field seasons in the past. So I also want to thank all the previous Piping Plover technicians. The amount of work that's put in to collect this data is huge. WSA flow forecasting and GIS teams who have been able to really techify this project with the DEMs and the different spatial apps that we use now. And we have a lot of census volunteers that come out every year. We couldn't cover the amount of ground without that kind of support from people who come out and help. And then support from different partners for the Piping Plover management. So ECCC, Saskatchewan Environment, and Nature Saskatchewan have all played really big parts in this. And then I have a plug. If anyone has sit through this and you're like, wow, this sounds really cool, I wish I could do this, you can, because I'm hiring 6 people. This is a summer position. From most of the positions are from May to the end of July. We have one person that goes until August. And the deadline is the 29th of January. I'm looking for either current students or recent graduates. So if you are interested, please put in your applications. You're free to take a photo if you want. It's also on our WSA website. And if you're like, oh, I don't know if birds are for me, I'm sorry I didn't convince you. But we also hire for our fisheries positions, and we also have macro invertebrate positions. So they all have various different dates. So if you're looking for a job this year, highly recommend you apply. With that, I'm done.